Edmund Hartley turned the key in the lock of his office door and tested the handle twice, a habit born of careful years. The brass was cold beneath his fingertips, damp with the particular wetness that river fog brings. Not quite rain, not quite mist, but something that settles into cloth and skin and the very wood of buildings that stand too close to the Thames. He could hear it beyond the door, that fog moving through the darkness of the Wapping Quay with the slow patience of something alive, muffling the creak of moored barges and the distant call of a night watchman making his rounds. Edmund stood very still in the narrow hallway of the customs house, his hand still on the door handle, and felt that small, persistent unease settle in his chest once more. It was the ledgers again. He had left them closed. He was certain of it. The brown leather covers aligned precisely at the edge of his desk, the way he always left them, with his inkpot to the right and his blotter square in the centre. But when he'd returned from his supper break not 20 minutes ago, the middle ledger had been open, its pages turned to a manifest from 3 weeks prior, a shipment of Dutch textiles that had passed inspection without incident. His inkpot had been moved, just slightly, perhaps an inch to the left. His chair, which he always pushed fully beneath the desk, had been angled outward, as though someone had risen from it in haste. Small things, easily explained by forgetfulness, or the cleaning woman's careless dusting. But this was the 3rd time in as many weeks, and Edmund Hartley was not a forgetful man. Customs clerks could not afford to be. Their livelihood depended on precision, on noticing the small discrepancies that might indicate fraud or smuggling, on remembering which merchant had declared 6 crates when 7 had been unloaded, on catching the trader who claimed cotton when the smell suggested something more profitable and far less legal. He released the door handle and drew his coat closer around his shoulders. The customs house hallway stretched before him, lit by a single gas lamp that hissed and flickered in its bracket, casting shadows that swayed with each gust of wind from the river. The building was old, built in the previous century when the docks had first begun their great expansion, and it carried the particular character of structures that have stood long beside water. The smell of damp wood and old paper, the faint taste of salt and tar on the air, the groan of timbers settling under their own weight. Edmund walked toward the main door, his footsteps echoing on the worn floorboards. Through the high windows he could see nothing but fog, thick and yellowish in the glow of the dock lamps, moving in slow currents like something with intent. It had rolled in with the turning tide, as it often did in November, transforming the familiar geography of warehouses and cranes and stacked cargo into something strange and unknowable. And there he stopped, listening. There were the footsteps again. They had started a week ago, always on foggy nights, always when he worked late to finish the day's manifests. Footsteps on the quay outside, measured and steady, moving parallel to the customs house. At first, Edmund had thought nothing of it. Dock work continued at all hours, and the night watchman made regular patrols. But then he had noticed the peculiar quality of these particular steps. They stopped precisely when he stopped walking. When he paused to adjust his coat or shift all the papers under his arm, the footsteps outside ceased as well. When he resumed walking, they began again, maintaining their distance, neither approaching nor receding. He had tested it twice now, deliberately stopping mid-stride, and both times the effect had been the same. The footsteps outside halted within a second of his own stopping, as though whoever walked the quay was listening for him as intently as he was listening for them. Edmund pushed open the main door and stepped out onto the quay. The fog enveloped him immediately, cool and clinging, carrying the full scent of the Thames at low tide, mud and weed and the particular smell of river water that has travelled through the great city, gathering its secrets. The gas lamps along the quay were dim globes of light suspended in the greyness, barely illuminating the cobblestones at their base. Beyond them, the river itself was invisible, marked only by the creak and slap of water against hulls, the groan of rope and chain, the occasional deep note of a steam whistle from some vessel making its way upstream in the darkness. The docks at night possessed a quality quite different from their daytime bustle. During the day, Wapping and Limehouse teemed with life, stevedores and sailors, customs inspectors and merchant captains. The whole great machinery of Empire's trade grinding through its work with shouts and curses and the screech of cargo cranes. But at night, with the day labourers gone to their homes and taverns, the docks became a place of echoes and absences, of sounds that carried too far in the fog, of shadows that moved in ways that made a man question what he had actually seen. Edmund walked north along the quay toward the omnibus stop, his hand in his pocket, fingers closed around the small notebook where he kept his private observations, the things that didn't belong in official ledgers, but troubled him none the less. He had begun the notebook 2 weeks ago, after Pemberton disappeared. Charles Pemberton had been a customs clerk, like himself, though assigned to the Western warehouse. A methodical man, a decade older than Edmund's 32 years, married with 3 children in Shadwell. Not a drinker, despite what Scotland Yard had concluded. Not the sort of man to stumble drunk off a quay into the Thames on a November night. Yet, that was the official explanation when Pemberton failed to arrive home after his late shift, and his body was never found. Drowned, surely. An accident, certainly. The Thames was dangerous in fog, and men sometimes misjudged their step. But Edmund had seen Pemberton's office the morning after he vanished. The door had been locked from the inside, the window shuttered, a cup of tea still sitting on the desk, half drunk and cold. Pemberton's coat had been missing, but his hat remained on its peg. His ledgers had been open, not to the current day's work, but to entries from weeks prior. The other clerks spoke of it in whispers during their dinner breaks, their voices carrying that particularly British mixture of scepticism and unease that appears when rational men are confronted with events that resist rational explanation. Old Griggs, the dock supervisor, had dismissed it all as nonsense. Pemberton had clearly left his office, locked it behind him out of habit, and then fallen into the river somewhere along the quay. The locked door meant nothing. The open ledgers meant nothing. The abandoned hat meant nothing. But 2 nights after Pemberton's disappearance, Edmund had been working late, finishing manifests by lamplight, when he had seen something through the high window of his office. He had risen to close the shutters against the fog, and had glimpsed, for just a moment, a figure moving between the warehouses opposite. A pale figure, lit from below by some source Edmund could not identify, seeming to stand not on the quay, but above it, as though suspended in the fog itself, its form wavering like something seen through water. He had stared at it for perhaps 10 seconds before it vanished, not walking away, but simply ceasing to be visible, swallowed by the darkness and mist. His hands had trembled as he fastened the shutters. He had told no one. What could he say? That he had seen a ghost? That the fog wraith the sailors whispered about, the pale figure that walked on water when the tide turned, was real? Edmund had been educated at a grammar school in Clerkenwell. He had read his Darwin and his Huxley. He didn't believe in ghosts. And yet... The omnibus stop materialized out of the fog, its small shelter offering minimal protection from the damp. Edmund was alone. At this hour, past 10 o'clock, few respectable people ventured into this part of London, and those who did were generally hurrying to get out again. He stood beneath the shelter's roof and listened to the sounds of the river, the lap, water, the creak of wood, the distant rhythm of machinery from one of the steam warehouses, the melancholy call of a barge horn somewhere in the fog. Behind him, far down the quay, he heard footsteps. He turned, peering into the greyness, but could see nothing beyond the nearest lamp. The footsteps continued for a moment, then stopped. Edmund remained very still, watching. After a long pause, he deliberately took 3 steps to the left. The footsteps resumed, moving parallel to his movement, then ceased again when he stopped. His heart was beating faster now, though he felt oddly detached from his fear, as though observing it from a distance. This was absurd. This was London, the greatest city on earth, the heart of civilization and reason. These docks processed more cargo in a month than most nations saw in a year. They were watched by police and customs agents and private guards employed by the shipping companies. There were no ghosts here. There were only men. Men with motivations. Men with schemes. Men who might have reasons for watching a customs clerk who kept meticulous records and noticed discrepancies in manifests. And yet, the alternative, that someone was deliberately following him, deliberately mimicking his movements, deliberately trying to frighten him, seemed somehow more disturbing than any supernatural explanation. The omnibus arrived with a clatter of hooves and a hiss of breath from its horses. The driver hunched on his seat with his collar turned up against the fog. Edmund climbed aboard, paid his penny, and found a seat near the back. As the vehicle lurched into motion, he looked back through the window at the receding quay. There, just visible in the glow of the furthest lamp, stood a pale figure. It was there for only a moment before the fog closed over it, but Edmund saw enough. The suggestion of a human form, oddly lit, standing in a place where the quay should give way to water. He closed his eyes and listened to the rattle of the omnibus wheels, to the breathing of the other passengers, to the driver's occasional call to his horses. When he opened them again and looked back, there was only fog. Edmund withdrew the notebook from his pocket and, by the dim light of the omnibus lamps, made a new entry. He dated it carefully, November 14th, 1887, and noted the time, the state of the tide, the weather conditions. Then he wrote, in his neat clerk's hand, "Seen again, quay near Warehouse 7, low tide, fog, appeared to stand on water, visible approximately 5 seconds before vanishing." Beneath this, he added, "Footsteps continue to match mine, pattern unchanged." He closed the notebook and sat back, feeling the small weight of decision settle into certainty. He could no longer dismiss this as imagination or coincidence. Something was happening at the Wapping docks, something that had perhaps claimed Pemberton, something that now seemed to have turned its attention toward him. He needed help, not from Scotland Yard, who had already dismissed Pemberton's disappearance as an unfortunate accident, and not from his supervisors, who would think him mad or drunk. But he had heard stories, as one does in London, of a consulting detective who resided in Baker Street, a man who specialized in cases that were unusual, that resisted ordinary explanation, a man named Sherlock Holmes. Edmund felt faintly foolish even considering it. What would he say? That he believed in fog wraiths? That his ledgers were being mysteriously disturbed? That footsteps followed him in the darkness? It sounded like the ravings of a superstitious child, or a mind unbalanced by too many late nights and too much solitude. And yet, Pemberton was gone. And yet the pattern continued, steady and deliberate. And yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching the customs house, watching him, waiting for something he could not name. The omnibus rolled on through the fog-wrapped streets, carrying Edmund Hartley from the world of docks and ships and river trade toward the respectable districts of the West End, where men sat by warm fires and read their evening papers, and believed that mystery and danger were things that happened in distant countries, not in the heart of London itself. Tomorrow, Edmund decided. Tomorrow he would go to Baker Street. He had nothing to lose but his dignity, and he'd already lost something more important, his certainty that the world operated according to rational principles, that patterns meant nothing, that the fog was just fog, and the darkness held no secrets. Tomorrow he would seek help. Tonight he would go home to his small rooms in Shadwell, lock his door carefully, and try not to listen for footsteps in the street outside. The morning arrived cold and clear, the fog of the previous night burned away by a pale November sun that cast long shadows across the streets of London. Edmund Hartley stood at the corner of Marylebone Road and Baker Street, his breath visible in the chill air, and felt the full weight of what he was about to do settle upon his shoulders like a physical thing. He had dressed with particular care that morning. His best coat, brushed free of the river smell that tended to cling to anything kept near the docks, his collar starched, his boots polished to a subdued shine. It was partly respect for the man he was about to consult, and partly a kind of armour, the costume of respectability that might make his story sound less like the ravings of a madman, and more like the legitimate concerns of a professional man who had noticed something genuinely amiss. The journey from Shadwell to Baker Street had been a study in contrasts. Each mile travelled a step away from one London and into another. The omnibus had carried him from the smoke-stained brick and narrow alleys of the Docklands, where the air tasted of coal and river, and the sweat of hard labour, through the commercial districts of the city, with their great warehouses and counting houses, and finally into the residential streets of Marylebone, where the buildings stood taller and cleaner, their windows bright with morning light, their doorsteps scrubbed, their brass fittings gleaming. It was not that Edmund was unfamiliar with this part of London. He had been born in Clerkenwell, after all, and had walked these streets often enough as a young man. But several years of working at the docks had changed his relationship with the city's geography. The East End, with its complex economy of cargo and commerce, its dense population of sailors and stevedores, and the whole apparatus of Empire's trade, had become his world. The West End, by contrast, felt oddly distant now, a place where people lived who did not wake to the sound of steam whistles or fall asleep to the creak of ships at anchor. Baker Street itself was a pleasant thoroughfare, lined with solid middle-class residences that spoke of professional success without ostentation. The homes of doctors and lawyers, of civil servants and military men on half pay, of the thousands who made up London's respectable middle ranks. Number 221 stood midway along the street, distinguished from its neighbours only by the brass plaque beside the door that read Holmes in simple lettering, and by the slightly more worn appearance of its front step, as though many visitors passed this way. Edmund stood before the door for a long moment, his hand raised to knock, feeling suddenly foolish. What was he doing here? What could this detective possibly do about disturbed ledges and mysterious footsteps? Perhaps he should simply return to his work, keep his head down, avoid working late shifts for a while. Perhaps the whole thing would resolve itself, revealed as nothing more than coincidence and an overactive imagination. But then he thought of Pemberton. Methodical, careful Pemberton, vanished without trace. He thought of the pale figure standing where no one should be able to stand. He thought of the footsteps that matched his own with such deliberate precision. He knocked. The door opened almost immediately, revealing a motherly woman in her middle years, her grey hair neatly pinned, her apron spotless, her expression conveying a mixture of professional welcome and gentle curiosity. "Good morning, sir," she said, her voice carrying the comfortable accent of someone London-born and London-raised. "Have you an appointment with Mr. Holmes?" "No, ma'am," Edmund said, and was grateful that his voice emerged steady. "I'm afraid I don't. I was hoping. That is, I have a matter I was hoping to consult him about. My name is Edmund Hartley. I'm a customs clerk at the Wapping Docks." The woman's expression warmed slightly, as though something in his honest nervousness appealed to her. "I'm Mrs. Hudson, Mr. Hartley. Mr. Holmes is at home, and I believe he's between cases at the moment, which means he'll likely be glad of a visitor. He gets rather restless when he hasn't a puzzle to occupy him. Do come in, out of the cold." She stepped aside, and Edmund entered the hallway, at once struck by the warmth and quiet of the interior. After the noise and chill of the street, the house seemed almost luxuriously peaceful. The hallway was papered in a dark green pattern, the floor covered with a worn but clean runner, the air carrying the faint scent of pipe tobacco and something else, coffee perhaps, and the particular smell of old books. "I'll let Mr. Holmes know you're here," Mrs. Hudson said, gesturing toward a small bench. "Won't be but a moment." She climbed the stairs with the easy competence of someone who had done so thousands of times, leaving Edmund to wait in the hallway. He could hear sounds from above, a voice, two voices, though he could not make out words. Then footsteps, and Mrs. Hudson reappearing at the top of the stairs. "Mr. Holmes will see you, Mr. Hartley. First floor, door on your right." Edmund climbed the stairs, his heart beating faster now, though whether from exertion or nervousness he could not say. At the top he found the door already open, and stepped into a room that seemed to contain, in concentrated form, all the comfortable disorder of a mind perpetually engaged in work. The sitting room at 221B Baker Street was not large, but it gave an impression of spaciousness through the height of its ceiling, and the generous windows that looked out onto the street. Every surface, however, was covered with the apparatus of investigation. Books stacked in precarious towers, papers scattered across a dining table that clearly served more for work than meals, chemical apparatus on a side table near the window, a violin resting on a chair, newspapers folded to particular articles, a Persian slipper pinned to the mantelpiece with what appeared to be a knife, and everywhere the evidence of a mind that valued utility over tidiness. 2 men occupied the room, the first standing near the window with his hands. In his pockets was tall and lean, with a sharp, angular face and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Edmund's clothes, his posture, his calloused hands, his nervousness, in a single sweeping glance. This, Edmund knew without introduction, was Sherlock Holmes. The second man, rising from an armchair by the fire with a welcoming smile, was shorter and more solidly built, with a military bearing softened by genuine warmth. "Mr. Hartley," he said, extending his hand, "I'm Dr. Watson. Please, do come in and sit down. You must be chilled from your journey. Mrs. Hudson will bring tea presently." The simple kindness of this greeting, the assumption that Edmund belonged here and was welcome, did more to ease his nervousness than any formal reassurance could have done. He shook Watson's hand, feeling the firm grip of someone who had worked with his hands, not the soft clasp of a drawing-room physician, but the practical strength of a man who had served in difficult places. "Mr. Hartley," Holmes said, and his voice was different from Watson's, lighter, faster, with a quality of focused intensity. "You work at the Wapping Customs House. You've been employed there for approximately 5 years. You were educated at a grammar school, likely in Clerkenwell or thereabouts, and you read, or used to read, the better class of periodicals. You live alone in Shadwell, within walking distance of your workplace. You are right-handed, methodical in your habits, and you have come here because something at your place of employment has disturbed you sufficiently to overcome your natural reluctance to seek help from a stranger. Please, sit down and tell me what has happened." Edmund stared at him, his mouth slightly open. "How did you—" "Your hands," Holmes said, moving from the window to take a seat across from Edmund. "They show the particular pattern of ink stains common to clerks who work with shipping manifests, the blue-black ink used in customs documentation, and the specific placement suggests you use a Waverley nib, which is standard issue in government offices. The stains are old and deep, indicating years of such work. Your coat, though well brushed, carries the faint smell of tar and the Thames, which places you near the docks. The cut of your coat and the quality of your shirt suggest clerical wages rather than manual labour, and the Wapping Customs House is the largest employer of customs clerks in that district." He steepled his fingers, his grey eyes fixed on Edmund with an attention that was simultaneously unnerving and oddly reassuring. Here was someone who genuinely saw, who missed nothing, who might actually understand what Edmund had come to report. "Your education is evident in your vocabulary and bearing," Holmes continued. "Working class, but not common. A grammar school boy who has bettered himself through application. The slight wear on your right cuff and the calluses on your right index and middle fingers confirm you write extensively and are right-handed. As for living in Shadwell, your boots show the characteristic mud of that district's streets, and the fact that you've walked here from the omnibus stop rather than taking a cab suggests you're within your budget, but careful with money. which in turn suggests you live modestly and alone, as family obligations would show different patterns of economy. The reluctance is simply human nature. Most people prefer to solve their own problems rather than admit they need help. But you're here, which means something has overcome that reluctance. Now, what is it? Edmund realized he had been holding his breath. He released it slowly and accepted the chair Watson had indicated, near enough to the fire that he could feel its warmth beginning to thaw his cold hands. Mrs. Hudson appeared with a tea tray, and Watson busied himself with pouring. A comfortable, domestic ritual that gave Edmund a moment to collect his thoughts. "I hardly know where to begin," Edmund said, accepting a cup of tea with quiet gratitude. The porcelain was warm against his palms, and the steam carried the scent of good Darjeeling, a small luxury that seemed impossibly civilized compared to the strong, cheap tea that sustained him through his working days. "Begin with what first made you uneasy," Watson said gently, settling into his chair with his own cup. "Don't worry about whether it sounds foolish or trivial. Just tell us what you've noticed." There was something about Watson's manner, kind without being patronizing, attentive without being invasive, that made confession easier. Edmund found himself speaking more freely than he had anticipated, describing the disturbed ledgers, the moved objects in his office, the pattern of intrusions always on foggy nights. He explained about Pemberton's disappearance, about Scotland Yard's dismissal of it as an accidental drowning, about his own doubts regarding that explanation. Holmes listened without interruption, his eyes half closed, his long fingers forming a bridge before his face. Watson listened differently, leaning forward slightly, his expression sympathetic, occasionally nodding to show he was following the narrative. Two different kinds of attention, Edmund realized, but both complete. "And then," Edmund said, his voice dropping slightly, "there are the footsteps, and the figure." He described the footsteps that stopped when he stopped, that matched his movements with such precise timing. He described, more hesitantly, the pale figure he had glimpsed, twice now, seeming to stand on the water itself, lit from below by some unexplained source. When he finished, there was a long silence. Edmund found himself gripping his teacup too tightly, waiting for the polite dismissal, the suggestion that he was overwrought or imaginative. Instead, Holmes opened his eyes fully and leaned forward with an expression of keen interest. "The footsteps stop when you stop," he said. "Not after you stop, but when you stop simultaneously." "Within a second," Edmund said. "I've tested it deliberately. The effect is consistent." "Excellent," Holmes said, and there was satisfaction in his voice. "That eliminates coincidence. Someone is listening for your movements and adjusting their own accordingly. That's not supernatural, Mr. Hartley. That's surveillance. Someone is watching you, and they're doing so with considerable discipline and purpose." Edmund felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he hadn't fully realized he'd been carrying. "Then I'm not imagining it." "Not in the slightest," Watson said warmly, "and I'd say you've shown considerable sense in documenting what you've observed and seeking help. Many men would have dismissed their own perceptions as fancy." Holmes rose and paced to the window, his movements quick and energetic. "The figure you saw, standing on the water. Describe its appearance more precisely. Height, clothing, any details you can recall." Edmund closed his eyes, bringing back the memory. "Pale," he said, The overall impression was of paleness, clothing perhaps, though I couldn't see clearly enough to say what kind. It seemed to waver, but that might have been the fog. The strangest thing was the light. It appeared to be lit from below, which created an odd effect, shadows falling upward, if that makes sense. It made the figure seem to float, rather than stand. Lit from below, Holmes repeated, his voice sharp with interest. Not by the dock lamps, then, which are positioned above. A separate light source, presumably on or near the water itself. Watson, do you note the implication? That someone is deliberately staging this apparition, Watson said thoughtfully, using light and fog to create an effect. Precisely. Holmes turned back to Edmund, his eyes bright. Mr. Hartley, someone at your docks is running an operation that requires privacy and the absence of witnesses. They're using superstition, the fear of a fog wraith, to clear the area on certain nights. Your colleague Pemberton likely noticed something, investigated, and was removed. Now you're showing the same pattern of attention to detail, the same careful observation. They're trying to frighten you away before you become similarly problematic. Or worse, Watson added quietly. Edmund felt cold, despite the fire's warmth. You think I'm in danger? I think, Holmes said, that you've done exactly the right thing in coming here. You've been careful and observant, but you've also made yourself visible as a potential threat to someone's scheme. Watson and I will accompany you back to Wapping tonight. I should very much like to see these docks for myself, particularly at low tide and in fog. But first, he moved to the dining table and began clearing a space among the papers. I need you to tell me everything you can remember about the nights when these events occurred. Dates, times, tidal conditions, weather, which ships were in dock, what cargo was being processed, every detail, no matter how insignificant it seems. Edmund set down his teacup and leaned forward. For the first time in weeks, he felt something other than isolated unease. He felt, instead, the beginning of hope. Dr. Watson, he said, turning to the other man, Mr. Holmes said you would accompany him tonight. Watson smiled, a quiet expression that carried both reassurance and determination. I wouldn't miss it, Mr. Hartley. My friend has a gift for seeing what others miss, but he occasionally needs someone to watch his back while he's doing so. That's where I come in. And besides, Holmes added, already sketching what appeared to be a map of the docks on a large sheet of paper. Watson has a calming effect on witnesses and a remarkably steady hand. Both may prove useful. Now then, Mr. Hartley, this office where Pemberton disappeared. Describe its layout and tell me precisely where everything was positioned when you saw it the following morning. Edmund began to speak, and Holmes began to draw, and Watson poured more tea. Outside the windows, Baker Street continued its morning business, cabs and carts and pedestrians pursuing their ordinary concerns, while in the sitting room at 221B, 3 men bent over a map of London's docks and planned an investigation into mysteries that walked on water and vanished into fog. For the first time since Pemberton's disappearance, Edmund Hartley felt he was no longer alone with his observations. Whatever haunted the Wapping Quay, whatever scheme required both secrecy and the appearance of supernatural intervention, it would soon face something more formidable than a frightened customs clerk. It would face Sherlock Holmes. The journey back to Wapping began in late afternoon, when the November sun was already sinking toward the rooftops of West London, casting the city in shades of amber and shadow. Holmes had spent the intervening hours in intense study, sending telegrams to the Port of London Authority, consulting tide tables and shipping schedules, and questioning Edmund with the methodical thoroughness of a man assembling a puzzle from scattered pieces. Now, as their hansom cab rattled eastward through streets that grew progressively narrower and darker, Holmes sat in an attitude of perfect stillness, his sharp eyes taking in everything, while his mind, Edmund suspected, worked through calculations invisible to ordinary observers. Watson sat beside him, wrapped in a heavy coat against the evening chill, his medical bag at his feet. A practical man prepared for practical contingencies. Edmund watched the transition of neighbourhoods with the familiarity of someone who had made this journey countless times. The respectable squares of Marylebone gave way to the commercial density of the city, where banks and counting houses stood shoulder to shoulder like sentries guarding Britain's wealth. Then came Whitechapel and Shadwell, where the buildings pressed closer together, and the streets filled with the evidence of lives lived at the margins of prosperity. Ragged children playing in alleyways, women carrying baskets from market stalls, men standing idle outside public houses, their caps pulled low against the cold. And finally, as the cab turned south toward the river, came the docks themselves. Even from a distance, the docks announced themselves through a change in the very air. The smell arrived first. That distinctive mixture of tar and rope and salt water, of coal smoke and fish, and the particular scent of cargo from distant places, tea and spices, timber and tobacco, the whole catalogue of empire compressed into warehouses that lined the Thames for miles. Then came the sounds, the shriek of steam winches, the shout of foremen, the thunder of cargo being loaded and unloaded, the deep horns of steamships, and the sharper calls of wherries and barges. As the cab approached the Wapping Quay, the sun dropped below the horizon entirely, and the gas lamps began their nightly illumination, pale circles of light that seemed to struggle against the gathering darkness and the fog that was already beginning to rise from the river. "Low tide is in 40 minutes, Holmes observed, checking his pocket watch. "The fog should thicken as the water recedes. Mr. Hartley, your customs house is which building?" Edmund pointed to a sturdy brick structure standing at the edge of the main quay, its windows glowing yellow against the twilight. "There, the one with the copper roof. My office faces the river, second window from the right on the ground floor." Holmes nodded, his gaze sweeping across the geography of the docks with the intensity of a military commander surveying a battlefield. "And warehouse 7, where you saw the figure most clearly, is beyond that row of cranes, perhaps 200 yards down river." Edmund indicated a large building whose bulk was already becoming indistinct in the thickening air. "It's used for textile storage, primarily. The quay in front of it is where the lighter boats unload from the larger ships anchored in the channel." "Excellent." Holmes stepped down from the cab and paid the driver, then stood for a moment in perfect stillness, his head slightly tilted, listening. Watson joined him, and Edmund followed, conscious once again of how different the docks felt at this hour. The day shift was ending. Workers streaming away from the warehouses, their voices carrying across the water, their boots loud on the cobblestones. But already the night's different population was emerging. The watchmen beginning their rounds, the crews of ships preparing for departure on the morning tide, and other, less easily categorized figures who moved in the shadows between buildings, conducting business that preferred darkness. "The tide is turning," Holmes murmured, and Edmund realized it was true. The river's voice was changing, the slap and gurgle of water against hulls taking on a different rhythm. The creak of mooring ropes adjusting as vessels settled into new positions. The Thames at low tide revealed itself gradually, the waterline dropping to expose the ancient pilings that supported the quays, the vast mudflats that stretched into the channel, the debris of centuries accumulated in the margins between land and water. "Dr. Watson," Holmes said quietly, "if you would remain with Mr. Hartley and make your observations from his office, I should like to walk the quay alone for a time. I want to understand the geography, and I want to be seen doing so." Watson frowned slightly. "Holmes, if there's danger—" "There won't be. Not yet. Whoever is running this operation won't move against a stranger conducting what appears to be casual observation. They'll watch me, certainly, but that's precisely what I want. I need to understand their patterns of surveillance." He turned to Edmund. "Your office has a clear view of the quay?" "Yes, particularly of the area near Warehouse 7. "Perfect. Watson, take up position there with Mr. Hartley. Note anything that moves, anyone who appears to be watching. I'll return within the hour." Before either of them could protest further, Holmes had turned and walked away into the gathering darkness, his tall figure quickly becoming one more shadow among the many that populated the docks at nightfall. Watson sighed. "He does this," he said to Edmund, with a combination of affection and exasperation. "Treats investigations like scientific experiments, with himself as both observer and occasionally as bait. Come, let's follow his instructions. I suspect he knows what he's doing, even if he doesn't always explain it." They made their way to the customs house, Edmund unlocking the main door with hands that trembled slightly, though whether from cold or nervousness he couldn't say. Inside, the building was quiet. Most of the clerks had departed for their evening meal or home, leaving only the night supervisor, old Michaels, who nodded at Edmund from his post near the stairs. "Working late again, Hartley?" Michaels said, his voice carrying the rasp of a lifelong smoker. "You'll ruin your eyes with all these evening hours." "Just showing a friend something," Edmund replied, gesturing to Watson. "We won't be long." They climbed to Edmund's small office, and he lit the lamp on his desk, keeping the flame low. The room was exactly as he'd left it that morning. Ledgers closed and aligned, inkpot in its proper place, chair pushed beneath the desk. Seeing it this way, in Watson's calming presence, it was almost possible to believe the disturbances had been imaginary. Watson moved to the window and looked out at the quay. The fog was thicker now, rolling in from the river in slow waves, transforming the dock lamps into dim stars suspended in greyness. Somewhere in that fog, Holmes was walking, observing, cataloguing. "Tell me about the men who work here," Watson said, his eyes still on the window. "The dock supervisor you mentioned? Griggs, was it?" "Yes, Samuel Griggs. He's been supervisor for about 3 years. Came up from the ranks. Was a stevedore himself before being promoted. Knows the work thoroughly." "And his character?" Edmund considered. "Efficient. A bit sharp with the men sometimes, but that's common enough in this work. He runs the schedules, assigns the crews, manages the warehouse access. A position of considerable responsibility. And considerable opportunity," Watson observed quietly. If one wanted to move cargo without proper inspection, having the supervisor's cooperation would be invaluable. The thought sent a chill through Edmund. He had worked alongside Griggs for years, never suspecting. But then, what had there been to suspect? Griggs did his work, kept the docks running efficiently, and showed no signs of unusual wealth or suspicious behaviour. They stood in silence for several minutes, watching the fog thicken and the night deepen. The sounds of the river came through the window, the eternal creak and splash, the distant call of a steam whistle, the clang of metal on metal from somewhere in the darkness. Then Watson stiffened slightly. "There," he said softly. "Do you see it?" Edmund looked where Watson indicated, and his breath caught. Between two moored lighters, perhaps 50 yards from where they stood, a pale figure had appeared. It stood motionless in what should have been open water, a luminous form that seemed to hover above the river's surface. Even knowing Holmes's theory that this was stagecraft, not supernatural, Edmund felt his skin prickle. The effect was uncanny. The figure was lit from below, casting its shadow upward into the fog, and the wavering quality of the light made it seem to breathe, to shift, to possess an animate quality that reason said was impossible. "Remarkable," Watson breathed. "I can see why it frightens people. Even knowing it must be trickery, the effect is deeply unsettling." They watched for perhaps 3 minutes. The figure remained absolutely still, and then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone, swallowed by fog and darkness. "Did you see how it vanished?" Watson asked. "Not walking, not moving laterally, but simply ceasing to be visible, as though a light were shuttered." "That's exactly what happened, I believe," came Holmes's voice from the doorway, making them both start. He entered the office, his coat damp with fog, his eyes bright with satisfaction. "The ghost stands on a barge lashed low between the pilings, below the usual waterline, so at high tide it's submerged and invisible. At low tide it rises just enough that a man can stand on its deck and appear to be standing on water. The light source is a shuttered lantern positioned below him, angled to cast its beam upward through the fog. When the performance is complete, the lantern is closed, hence the sudden disappearance." He moved to the window and looked out at the place where the figure had stood. "I found the barge itself, an old lighter, painted dark to blend with the water, held in place by chains fastened to 2 pilings. Quite ingenious, really. Only visible from certain angles, and only at low tide. The rest of the time, it's simply part of the river's furniture, unnoticed among the dozens of vessels moored along this stretch." "But why?" Edmund asked. "What's the purpose of staging such an elaborate deception?" Holmes turned from the window, his expression grave. "To clear witnesses, Mr. Hartley. On nights when cargo needs to be moved without observation, cargo that has not been properly inspected or manifested, the ghost appears. Superstitious dock workers flee. Even the police and night watchmen avoid the area, having heard the rumours. And in that brief window of privacy, a smuggling operation can proceed without interference." "And Pemberton?" Watson asked quietly. "Noticed something, I suspect. Perhaps spotted the barge during daylight, or observed the pattern of which ships moved cargo on which nights. He investigated, asked questions, and became a liability." Holmes's voice was gentle but serious. "They removed him. Not killed necessarily, though we cannot yet rule that out. more likely drugged and transported elsewhere, to emerge confused and discredited if he speaks of what he saw. Edmund felt his legs weaken, and he sat heavily in his desk chair. And they've been watching me because I'm showing the same curiosity. Precisely. Your meticulous nature, the very quality that makes you an excellent customs clerk, has marked you as dangerous to their operation. Holmes crossed the room and placed a hand on Edmund's shoulder, a rare gesture of physical reassurance. But you're not alone now, Mr. Hartley, and we're going to do something they won't expect. What's that? Edmund asked. Holmes smiled, and there was something predatory in the expression, the look of a hunter who has found his quarry's trail. We're going to find out where they're taking their victims, what they're smuggling, and who's organizing this entire scheme. And then we're going to shut it down in a manner so complete that the Thames Fog will never shelter criminals again. Outside the window, the fog continued its slow roll across the docks, thick and concealing. But somewhere within it, Edmund knew, there were men who thought themselves invisible, protected by superstition and darkness and careful planning. They had not yet encountered Sherlock Holmes. The investigation began in earnest the following morning, though to the casual observer, nothing particularly dramatic was occurring. Holmes had returned to Baker Street in the small hours, his mind already working through the architecture of the scheme they had glimpsed. Edmund, for his part, had reported to work at his usual time, carrying with him Holmes's instructions to continue his normal routine while observing everything with fresh attention. Act as though nothing has changed, Holmes had told him before they parted. Go about your duties, but note which ships move cargo on foggy nights, which manifests seem irregular, who asks questions about your work. You are my eyes inside the customs house, Mr. Hartley. I need you to be both invisible and observant. Now, 2 days later, the pieces were beginning to assemble themselves into a coherent picture, though the full design remained tantalizingly obscure. Holmes had spent those days in a flurry of activity that would have exhausted a lesser man, interviewing dock workers in riverside taverns, consulting shipping records at the Port Authority, tracing ownership of vessels through layers of shell companies and false names, and walking the Thames foreshore at low tide, examining the geography of mud and piling and hidden current with the attention of a man reading a manuscript in a forgotten language. Watson had accompanied him on many of these excursions, and it was Watson who now sat in the comfortable chair at 221B, relating their findings to Edmund, who had been summoned to Baker Street for an evening conference. Mrs. Hudson had provided tea and a late supper, cold meat and bread, cheese and pickles, which sat on the table between them, largely untouched, as the three men bent over Holmes's growing collection of maps and notes. The pattern, Holmes said, standing by the window with his pipe in hand, smoke curling toward the ceiling, is more elegant than I initially suspected. Our criminals aren't merely opportunistic smugglers, but rather methodical operators running a system that has likely been functioning for months, perhaps longer. He moved to the table and tapped a finger on a shipping schedule covered in his spidery handwriting. The Ghost appears on average once every 9 days, specifically on nights when the tide reaches its lowest point, between the hours of 10 and midnight, and when fog is forecast. These conditions are predictable, which allows for advance planning. But they can't control the fog, Edmund observed. Surely that introduces uncertainty into their schedule. Indeed, But they work around it. When fog fails to materialize on an optimal tide night, they simply wait for the next suitable combination of conditions. The Thames provides fog reliably enough in autumn and winter that they're never waiting more than a week or two. Watson leaned forward, pointing to a list of ship names. And we've identified the vessel central to their operation, the Cormorant, a steam tug owned by something called the Thames River Transport Company, which appears to exist primarily on paper. The company's registered office is an accommodation address in Cheapside, and the actual ownership traces back through 3 different entities before disappearing entirely into legal obscurity. The Cormorant is unremarkable in itself, Holmes continued, which is precisely the point. She's a small tug, the sort that moves lighters and barges between the deep-water moorings and the warehouse docks dozens of times daily. No one pays particular attention to her movements. But here, he pulled out another document, this one marked with red ink, is what makes her interesting. On every night when the ghost has been observed, the Cormorant has moved cargo that, all according to official manifests, should not have required moving at all. Edmund studied the document, his customs clerk's eye immediately catching the irregularities. "These barges are listed as empty," he said slowly, "awaiting cargo, scheduled for loading the following day. There's no reason to move them at night." "Precisely. Yet the Cormorant does move them, always during the 2-hour window when the ghost has cleared the quay of witnesses. The barges are repositioned, ostensibly for operational efficiency, and in the process they pass through a section of the river that is not well lit and not regularly patrolled. Where they're loaded with smuggled goods," Watson concluded. "Or," Holmes said, raising a finger, "where goods are transferred from one vessel to another, bypassing the customs inspection entirely. A ship arrives from the continent, anchors in the legal mooring area, and undergoes the standard inspection. But certain items from its cargo are not declared. Those items are transferred at night, in darkness and fog, into barges ostensibly empty, which are then moved by the Cormorant to warehouses where they're unloaded without paperwork, without tax, without any official record of their existence." The elegance of it struck Edmund with the force of revelation. "And because the barges appear empty on paper, no one thinks to inspect them during the transfer. The customs focus is on the cargo coming off the ships at the official docks, not on empty vessels being repositioned." "Exactly so. It's a system that exploits the very thoroughness of customs procedures. Everyone is watching the declared cargo so carefully that one notices the undeclared cargo moving through the shadows." Holmes began pacing, his energy barely contained. "But the system requires several elements to function: access to shipping schedules, knowledge of customs routines, the ability to falsify manifests, and physical control over the movement of vessels. That suggests someone in a position of significant authority within the dock operations." "Griggs?" Edmund said quietly. "It has to be Griggs. As dock supervisor, he controls the work schedules, assigns inspection priorities, manages warehouse access. He'd know exactly when and how to move cargo without attracting attention." Holmes nodded. "Samuel Griggs is indeed central to our investigation. I've made inquiries about him, discreetly, of course. He's worked at the docks for 15 years, promoted to supervisor 3 years ago. His official salary is modest, yet he recently purchased a house in Bow, significantly beyond what such earnings should afford. He explains this as an Inheritance from an uncle. And perhaps it is. Or perhaps it's the proceeds of a very profitable criminal enterprise. Watson reached for his teacup, found it cold, and set it down again with a slight grimace. But Holmes, if Griggs is the organizer, who's the man playing the ghost? Surely he's not standing out there on a barge in the fog himself. No, that role belongs to another, someone expendable enough to take the physical risk, loyal enough to maintain silence, and desperate enough to participate in such an enterprise. I've been making inquiries among the dock workers, and several names have emerged of men who've suddenly acquired money recently, who've been seen in Griggs's company, who have a history of, shall we say, flexible morality. Holmes pulled out a small notebook and flipped through its pages. The most likely candidate is a man named Albert Trask, former actor, performed in the Pennygaff theatres in Whitechapel until 5 years ago, when the drink got the better of him. Since then, he's picked up work where he can. Occasional labour at the docks, scene shifting at the music halls, any employment that tolerates unreliability. But recently, he's been seen looking considerably better. New clothes, meals at taverns he previously couldn't afford, paying off debts that had followed him for years. An actor, Watson said thoughtfully. That would explain the theatrical quality of the ghost performance. He'd know how to use light and positioning to create an effect. Indeed, and an actor fallen on hard times would be vulnerable to recruitment by someone offering steady money for relatively simple work. Stand on a barge, hold a lantern, appear ghostly for a few minutes while real business is conducted elsewhere. Trask likely has no idea of the full scope of the operation. He's just a prop in someone else's production. Edmund felt a mixture of fascination and growing unease as the conspiracy revealed itself. But the missing men, Pemberton and the others, where do they fit? If this is simply smuggling, why remove witnesses so dramatically? Holmes's expression grew sombre. That, Mr. Hartley, is the question that troubles me most. Smuggling is an economic crime, serious, certainly, but typically non-violent. Smugglers want to avoid attention, not create it by making people vanish, which suggests either that the cargo involved is sufficiently valuable to justify such extreme measures, or there's something else happening, Watson finished quietly, something beyond mere smuggling. The room fell silent for a moment, each man contemplating the darker possibilities. Outside the windows, Baker Street pursued its evening routines, cabs rattling past, pedestrians hurrying home to their suppers, the lamplighter making his rounds. London's ordinary life proceeding in comfortable ignorance of the schemes being plotted in its shadows. "I need to know what happened to Pemberton," Edmund said finally. "He has a wife, children. They deserve to know the truth, whatever it is." Holmes turned from the window, his face illuminated by the lamplight, and Edmund saw something in his expression that was almost gentle, a recognition of the human cost behind the intellectual puzzle. "We will find out, Mr. Hartley. I promise you that. But we must be patient and methodical. If we move too quickly, we risk alerting Griggs and his associates, and they will simply disappear, taking their secrets with them." "What's our next step, then?" Watson asked. "Two parallel investigations," Holmes replied. "First, I need to determine exactly what cargo is being smuggled, and where it's going after it bypasses customs. That will require surveillance of the warehouses Griggs controls, and possibly following one of the Cormorant's nighttime transfers. Second, and more urgently, I need to understand the locked room mystery of Pemberton's disappearance. He vanished from a sealed customs office with no visible means of exit. Understanding that mechanism will likely lead us to where he was taken, and possibly to where he is now, if he still lives. Edmund's hands tightened on his teacup. You think he might be alive? I think it's possible. If the goal was simply to kill him, why the theatrical disappearance? Why lock the room from inside? Why create a mystery that would draw investigation? No, there's a purpose to the method, and that purpose likely involves Pemberton being somewhere he can neither escape from nor communicate from, but where he's being kept alive. As insurance, Watson said suddenly. If he's alive, he can potentially be returned if suspicion grows too intense, drugged, confused, unable to recall clear details, but alive. It makes the entire affair seem less sinister. An accident, a mental breakdown, anything but murder and smuggling. Precisely, Watson. Murder draws the determined attention of Scotland Yard. Disappearance, followed by confused reappearance, suggests tragedy, rather than crime. It's the safer approach for criminals who want to continue their operation indefinitely. Holmes crossed to his desk and pulled out a large-scale map of the Wapping docks, spreading it across the table and anchoring its corners with books. Now, Mr. Hartley, I need you to show me exactly where Pemberton's office was located, and I need you to describe the building's architecture. Floors, walls, foundations, anything built before the current structure, any renovations or modifications you're aware of. If there's a hidden exit from that room, it exists within the physical structure of the building, and buildings keep their secrets in predictable places. Edmund leaned over the map, and for the next hour they worked through the details. The customs house's history, its construction in 1802, its various expansions and renovations, the old dock infrastructure it had been built atop, the warren of tunnels and culverts and drainage systems that underlay all of London's riverside buildings. Holmes questioned him with relentless thoroughness, sketching diagrams, making calculations, occasionally leaping up to consult one of the many reference books that lined his shelves. Watson watched, smoking his pipe, occasionally interjecting a question or observation, but largely letting Holmes conduct his intellectual excavation of the problem. Edmund found himself swept up in the process, his customs clerk's memory for detail proving valuable, as he recalled architectural features he'd never consciously noticed. The slight incline of the customs house floor, the dampness of certain walls, the way sounds echoed differently in different rooms. As midnight approached, Holmes finally straightened, rolling his shoulders to release tension. I believe I know how it was done, he said quietly. And if I'm right, tomorrow we'll find both the method and quite possibly your missing colleague. But it will require a visit to the customs house at an hour when we can work undisturbed, and it will require your assistance, Mr. Hartley. Are you willing? Edmund thought of Pemberton, methodical, careful Pemberton, with his wife and children waiting for news that never came. He thought of the locked office, the abandoned hat, the mystery that Scotland Yard had dismissed as mere misadventure. Yes, he said simply. Tell me what you need me to do. Holmes smiled, and it was the smile of a man who had found the thread that, when pulled, would unravel the entire mystery. Bring your keys to the customs house, he said, and bring a lantern. Tomorrow night we're going to look beneath the floor. The customs house stood silent in the pre-dawn darkness, its windows blank and lightless, its familiar bulk transformed by the hour into something vaguely ominous. Edmund unlocked the main door with hands that trembled only slightly, a combination of cold and anticipation, and stepped aside to let Holmes and Watson enter. The hallway smelled of old paper and lamp, oil, and their footsteps echoed too loudly in the emptiness. "Michaels, the night supervisor, leaves at 4, Edmund whispered, though there was no one to overhear. "We have perhaps 2 hours before the morning staff begins arriving." Holmes nodded, already moving down the corridor with the focused purpose of a man who knew exactly what he was looking for. Watson followed, carrying his medical bag in one hand and a shuttered lantern in the other. Edmund brought up the rear, his own lantern casting wavering shadows on the walls. Pemberton's office was on the ground floor, 3rd door on the left. Edmund had avoided it since his colleague's disappearance. Someone else had been assigned to manage that section of manifests, but now he turned the key in the lock and pushed open the door. The room exhaled stale air, the particular smell of a space that has been closed and unused. Dust motes danced in the lantern light. The office was small, perhaps 12 feet by 10, with a single window, facing the quay, now shuttered against the darkness outside. A desk stood against one wall, its surface still holding Pemberton's possessions. A blotter, an inkstand, a row of ledgers, a cup that still bore the brown stain of tea long since evaporated. His hat hung on its peg by the door, a brown bowler that would never be collected, a small monument to an ordinary life interrupted. Holmes set his lantern on the desk and immediately dropped to his knees, examining the floorboards with an intensity that bordered on reverence. Watson positioned himself by the door, keeping watch, while Edmund stood uncertainly in the middle of the room, feeling like an intruder in a space that had become, through tragedy, almost sacred. "The floor is oak," Holmes murmured, running his long fingers across the boards. "Original to the building's construction, I'd say. 1802, you mentioned, Mr. Hartley. Yes, the craftsmanship is consistent with that period. But here," his fingers found a seam between 2 boards. "There's been more recent work. Do you see? This section has been cut and refitted. The nails are newer, the wood slightly different in colour where it's been handled." He pulled a small tool from his pocket, a thin piece of metal that Edmund recognized as a lockpick, and used it to probe the gap between the boards. "And there's no dust in this seam, despite the room being unused for weeks. That suggests movement, regular opening and closing. Watson, bring your lantern closer." Watson complied, kneeling beside Holmes and angling the light downward. In its glow, Edmund could now see what Holmes had detected, a rectangular section of floorboards, perhaps 3 feet by 4 feet, that didn't quite match the surrounding wood. The difference was subtle, visible only to someone looking for it, but once seen, it was unmistakable. "A trap door," Watson said quietly, "hidden beneath. What was here? Mr. Hartley, do you recall the room's arrangement when you saw it? After Pemberton disappeared?" Edmund closed his eyes, bringing back the memory. "There was a rug," he said slowly, "a small Turkish rug, under his desk chair, and his chair was pushed back at an angle, as though he'd risen quickly. The rug would have concealed the seams," Holmes said, satisfaction in his voice. "And the chair's position suggests he was standing when he was taken, likely examining the opened trapdoor himself, curious about what lay beneath. Show me where the chair was positioned." Edmund indicated the spot, and Holmes nodded. He would have been standing directly over the opening when someone emerged from below, or when he was pulled down into it. Either way, surprise would have prevented any significant struggle. He glanced up at the door. You said the door was locked from inside when you found it. Yes, the key was in the lock, turned. Simple enough to accomplish. The attacker, or attackers, subdue Pemberton, probably with laudanum-soaked cloth held over his nose and mouth until he loses consciousness. They lower him through the trapdoor, descend after him, then reach up and lock the door from below before pulling it shut. The room appears sealed. Pemberton has vanished, and the only witness is unconscious and being carried through whatever passage lies beneath our feet. Holmes produced a wider tool, a small pry bar, and worked it into the seam between boards. Mr. Hartley, Watson, step back, please. I'm not certain how well this has been maintained, and I've no wish to send anyone tumbling into darkness. He applied pressure, and the section of floor lifted with a groan of protesting wood. A musty exhalation of air emerged from the opening, cold, damp, carrying the unmistakable smell of the Thames at low tide. Holmes lifted the trapdoor fully, revealing a square of darkness, and, just visible in the lantern light, the top rungs of a wooden ladder descending into blackness. Watson brought his lantern to the edge and held it over the opening. The light penetrated perhaps 10 feet down, revealing rough brick walls slick with moisture, and, at the bottom, what appeared to be a tunnel running perpendicular to the customs house. "A culvert," Holmes said, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. "Part of the old drainage system built when these docks were first constructed. The Thames is tidal, and without proper drainage, the entire area would flood with every high tide. They built an extensive network of brick tunnels to channel the water away. Most of them were sealed decades ago when more modern systems were installed, but some remain, forgotten and unmapped." He swung himself onto the ladder with the agility of a man half his age. "I'm going down. Watson, keep watch from above. Mr. Hartley, I'll call if I need you to follow." "Holmes, be careful," Watson said, his voice carrying the tension of a man who had seen his friend take too many risks. "We don't know what's down there, or if the structure is sound. It's held for 80 years, Watson. I trust it will endure another quarter hour." And with that, Holmes descended into the darkness, his lantern light growing fainter with each rung. Edmund and Watson knelt by the opening, watching the glow move beneath them. They could hear Holmes's footsteps, the splash of water, his voice echoing oddly as he spoke observations to himself. Minutes passed with excruciating slowness. Then Holmes's voice called up, clearer now. "Watson, Mr. Hartley, come down both of you, and bring both lanterns. You'll want to see this." The ladder was slippery with condensation, and Edmund descended carefully, acutely aware of the drop beneath him. The air grew colder as he climbed down, and damper, until his feet found solid ground, or rather found brick paving covered with a thin film of water and mud. The tunnel stretched in both directions, its arched ceiling perhaps 7 feet high, its walls running with moisture. The smell was overwhelming. River, water, and decay, the accumulated sediment of decades. Holmes stood perhaps 20 feet along the tunnel, his lantern illuminating something on the ground. As Edmund and Watson joined him, they saw what he had found. Footprints in the mud, multiple sets, some leading deeper into the tunnel, some returning. And beside the footprints, drag marks, the unmistakable trail of something heavy being pulled through the passage. "They brought him this way," Holmes said quietly, gesturing along the tunnel. "Unconscious, dragged through the water and mud. The tunnel runs eastward, parallel to the quay for approximately 200 yards before turning south toward the river. At low tide, it would be navigable. Unpleasant, certainly, but passable. At high tide—" He gestured at marks on the wall, showing where water had risen nearly to the ceiling. "At high tide, it becomes completely submerged. They would have had to time this carefully, moving Pemberton during the falling tide to ensure they didn't drown him or themselves in the process." Watson knelt to examine the drag marks more closely, his medical training evident in the careful attention he gave to the evidence. "The marks are consistent with a man being pulled by his arms or shoulders. And here," he indicated a disturbance in the mud. "He may have begun to wake and struggle slightly, but there's no sign of sustained resistance, which suggests he remained largely unconscious throughout the transit." "Where does the tunnel lead?" Edmund asked, his voice sounding small in the enclosed space. "To the river, ultimately," Holmes replied, beginning to walk along the passage, following the trail. "These culverts were designed to drain into the Thames, but along the way they intersect with other passages, connect to building foundations, branch into systems that served warehouses and factories. A person who knew this network could move beneath the docks completely unseen, emerging at any number of locations. They followed the tunnel eastward, their lanterns creating a small island of light in the surrounding darkness. The passage curved and narrowed, then widened again. Side tunnels branched off at intervals, disappearing into impenetrable blackness. The sound of water was constant, dripping from the ceiling, trickling along the floor, the distant rush of the Thames itself somewhere ahead. After perhaps 15 minutes of careful walking, Holmes stopped abruptly. "Here," he said, pointing to a section of wall where the brickwork looked newer, less weathered. "This has been opened recently, a sealed passage that's been unsealed. And look," he indicated the ground, "the drag marks turn here, into this side tunnel." The side passage was narrower, barely wide enough for 2 men to walk abreast, and its ceiling was lower, forcing them to duck slightly. But after only 30 feet, it opened into a small chamber, an old storage room, perhaps, or a junction point for multiple drainage lines. And in that chamber, illuminated by their combined lanterns, they found evidence of recent occupation. A pile of empty burlap sacks in one corner, a tin cup still half filled with water, a length of rope coiled against the wall, and most significantly, a wool blanket, discarded but not old, bearing faint stains that Watson examined with professional concern. "Laudanum," Watson said, sniffing the fabric carefully. "And recent. Within the past month, certainly. Holmes, someone was kept here." "Kept, then moved," Holmes agreed, examining the rope. "This shows wear from binding. Wrists, I'd say, from the diameter and the pattern of fraying. Pemberton was brought here, kept unconscious or semi-conscious with laudanum, held for a period. Hours, days, and then transported elsewhere." "But where?" Edmund asked, feeling both relief that evidence of Pemberton's existence had been found and horror at what that existence had entailed. Where would they take him from here? Holmes turned, slowly, his lantern raised, examining the chamber's walls. "There," he said finally, pointing to another passage, this one even narrower, barely more than a crawl space. That passage runs south towards the river's edge. At low tide, it would open onto the mudflats, or possibly directly into a vessel moored against the quay. A barge, perhaps, or a small boat. From there, Pemberton could be moved anywhere along the Thames, taken to any of 1,000 hiding places between here and the sea. The three men stood in silence for a moment, contemplating the horror of it. A man drugged and dragged through darkness, held prisoner in a brick chamber beneath the very docks where he had worked, then transported like cargo to an unknown fate. The Thames, which brought wealth and commerce to London, also concealed this. A network of hidden spaces where crimes could be committed beyond the reach of law or light. "We need to search downstream," Watson said finally. If they moved him by water, there must be a place they took him. A warehouse, a ship, somewhere they could hold him without risk of discovery. "Agreed," Holmes said. "But for now, we've learned what we came to learn. We know the method of Pemberton's disappearance, and we know he was alive when he was taken. That gives us both a direction for our search, and, more importantly, leverage." "Leverage?" Edmund asked. Holmes's expression was grim, but determined. "We're going to set a trap, Mr. Hartley. We're going to make Griggs and his associates believe that another witness has become problematic, that another customs clerk has discovered something dangerous. And when they come to make that clerk disappear through this same hidden route, we're going to be waiting in the darkness. We're going to catch them in the act, and we're going to make them tell us where they've taken your colleague." He started back toward the ladder, moving with renewed energy. "Come, we have much to prepare, and the morning staff will be arriving soon. We must seal this trapdoor again and leave no sign of our visit. But tonight we return, and we end this." The fog came in thick that evening, rolling off the Thames with the falling tide, transforming the Wapping docks into a landscape of muffled sounds and uncertain shapes. It was exactly the conditions Holmes had anticipated, indeed, had counted upon when he had sent his carefully crafted message earlier that day. The message had been simple, delivered through official channels that Griggs would certainly monitor. A memo from the Port Authority, requesting that Customs Clerk Edmund Hartley compile a comprehensive review of all nighttime barge movements over the past 3 months, with particular attention to vessels moved during low tide and fog conditions. The review was to be completed within the week, working late hours, if necessary, to meet the deadline. It was precisely the sort of inquiry that would alarm anyone running a smuggling operation through nighttime transfers. And more importantly, it painted Edmund as a threat, a diligent clerk asking dangerous questions, noticing patterns, compiling evidence. Exactly the sort of witness who needed to be quietly removed. Now, as darkness settled over the docks and the fog thickened to an almost tangible presence, Edmund sat at his desk in the customs house, a lamp burning at his elbow, ledgers spread before him in a convincing display of industry. He was alone in the building, or appeared to be. In reality, Holmes and Watson waited in the darkness of an adjoining office, the door between them left slightly ajar. And Inspector Lestrade with 3 constables occupied the basement storage room, positioned near the tunnel entrance they had discovered 2 days prior. The trap was set. Now they had only to wait. Edmund tried to focus on the actual work before him. There was no point in merely pretending to work when real tasks needed completion, but found his attention constantly drawn to the sounds outside, The creak of ships at anchor, the splash of water against hulls, the footsteps of the night watchman making his rounds. And beneath it all, the peculiar silence that fog brings, that sense of the world being wrapped in cotton wool, sounds dying at their source rather than travelling. Through the window he could see almost nothing, just the nearest dock lamp, a faint yellow glow suspended in greyness, and beyond it layers of obscurity that could hide anything, or anyone. The clock on the wall ticked toward 10. The tide would reach its lowest point within the hour. If the pattern held, if Griggs intended to move tonight, it would be soon. Edmund's hand trembled slightly as he turned a page in the ledger, and he forced himself to breathe slowly, steadily. Holmes had assured him he was in no real danger. "We'll be watching every moment, Mr. Hartley, and at the first sign of threat, we'll intervene." But knowing protection was near and feeling safe were different things entirely. He was bait, however willing, and bait was meant to be vulnerable, to draw predators into the open. A sound from the corridor made him stiffen. Footsteps, slow and measured, approaching along the hallway. Through the slightly open door to the adjoining office, he heard the faintest rustle of movement as Holmes positioned himself to see. The footsteps stopped outside Edmund's door. A long pause, as though someone was listening, evaluating. Then a knock, casual and unhurried. "Mr. Hartley, still at work, I see." Edmund recognized the voice immediately. Samuel Griggs, the dock supervisor. He forced his expression into one of mild surprise rather than fear, and called out, "Come in, Mr. Griggs." The door opened, and Griggs entered, his broad frame filling the doorway. He was a man in his late 40s, weathered by years of dock work, his face carrying the particular hardness that came from rising through rough company to a position of authority. He smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. "Burning the midnight oil again," Griggs said, closing the door behind him. "Not quite shutting it," Edmund noted, "but leaving it nearly closed. That memo from the Port Authority has you working late, eh?" "Just being thorough," Edmund replied, keeping his voice steady. "The review they've requested is quite detailed. I want to make sure I have all the relevant records." "Very conscientious of you." Griggs moved into the room, his gaze sweeping across the open ledgers with an assessment that was too careful, too intent. "You know, Mr. Hartley, sometimes conscientiousness can be inconvenient, both for oneself and for others. I'm sorry, Mr. Griggs, I don't follow your meaning." Griggs picked up one of the ledgers, flipping through its pages with fingers that left faint smudges on the paper. "What I mean is, sometimes it's wiser to do one's work without asking too many questions. To record what needs recording and leave the larger patterns to those in positions of greater authority. Pemberton, for instance, he was conscientious too, perhaps too much so." The mention of Pemberton sent ice through Edmund's veins, but he kept his expression neutral. "Pemberton drowned, didn't he? A terrible accident." "Was it?" Griggs set down the ledger and moved closer, his bulk casting a shadow across Edmund's desk. "Or did poor Pemberton simply see things he shouldn't have seen, notice things that would have been better left unnoticed? It's dangerous, Mr. Hartley, working late at the docks. Fog can be disorienting. A man could lose his way, fall into the river. Or," he paused meaningfully, "other misfortunes could occur." Edmund's heart was hammering now, but he forced himself to meet Griggs's gaze. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Griggs?" "Threatening? No, no." Griggs smiled again, and this time there was something almost regretful in it. "I'm simply offering friendly advice. This review you're conducting, perhaps it would be best if certain anomalies weren't noticed, certain patterns left unremarked upon. I could make it worth your while, Mr. Hartley. A man in your position, living in Shadwell on a clerk's wages, a bit of extra income could improve your circumstances considerably." So there it was. First the threat, then the bribe. Edmund felt a flash of anger cut through his fear. "I'm not interested in extra income earned through looking the other way, Mr. Griggs." The smile vanished from Griggs's face. "That's unfortunate. Very unfortunate indeed." He glanced toward the window, where fog pressed against the glass like something alive. "You know, I think you're not feeling well, Mr. Hartley. You look quite pale. Perhaps you should step outside for some air." "I'm perfectly fine where I am. I insist." Griggs's voice had gone flat, dangerous. His hand moved to his pocket, and Edmund saw the outline of something there. A cloth, likely, soaked with laudanum, the same method they'd used on Pemberton. "Come now, Mr. Hartley, don't make this difficult." "I think," came Holmes's voice from the doorway, sharp and clear, "that Mr. Hartley will remain exactly where he is." Griggs spun, his hand still in his pocket, and found himself facing not only Holmes and Watson, who had emerged from the adjoining office, but also Inspector Lestrade and his constables, who had come up silently from the basement. The dock supervisor's face went through a rapid series of expressions: shock, calculation, rage, before settling into a kind of dull resignation. "Sherlock Holmes," he said flatly, "I should have known. When that memo came through, so perfectly timed, so perfectly designed to flush out anyone paying attention, I should have known it was a trap." "Yet you came anyway," Holmes observed, moving into the room with Watson close behind. "Which speaks either to desperation or to arrogance. I suspect both. Inspector, if you would." Lestrade stepped forward, and one of his constables produced handcuffs. "Samuel Griggs, I'm arresting you on suspicion of smuggling, kidnapping, and conspiracy to commit fraud against Her Majesty's customs. You'll come with us quietly, I trust." Griggs made no move to resist as the cuffs were applied, but his eyes remained on Holmes. "You think you've won? You've caught nothing. One dock supervisor easily replaced. The operation will continue. The Cormorant will sail tomorrow night as planned. The Ghost will appear on schedule, and you'll have accomplished precisely nothing." "Will it?" Holmes asked mildly. "Will the Cormorant sail? Let me tell you what I know, Mr. Griggs, and then you may reconsider your position. I know about the hidden barge between the pilings. I know about Albert Trask and his theatrical performance as the fog wraith. I know about the tunnel system beneath these docks and the chamber where you held Pemberton. I know the Cormorant transfers cargo to barges falsely manifested as empty, and I know those barges deliver their contents to Warehouse 12, which you control through a shell company. I know your buyers, your suppliers, and the routes your goods take after they leave London. Shall I continue?" The colour had drained from Griggs's face. "You can't know all that. You've only been investigating for 4 days, Holmes finished. "Yes, quite sufficient time when one knows how to look and whom to ask. Your operation was ingenious, Mr. Griggs, I'll grant you that. Using superstition to clear witnesses, exploiting the complexity of dock operations to move illegal cargo, maintaining enough legitimate business to avoid suspicion, all quite clever. But you made 2 critical errors. First, you underestimated the intelligence of men like Mr. Hartley and his colleague Pemberton. And second, you drew attention to yourselves through the very theatricality meant to divert attention. A ghost that appears on schedule, always at low tide, always when certain ships are moving cargo. That's not supernatural, mister. Griggs, that's a pattern, and patterns can be decoded. Where is Pemberton? Edmund demanded, rising from his desk. The fear had burned away, leaving only anger and determination. What have you done with him? Griggs's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, the door burst open and another constable entered, breathing hard. Inspector, we've secured the barge and arrested Trask. He's confessing everything, says he'll cooperate fully if we treat him leniently. And there's more. We found a steamship moored downriver, the Mersey Star. She's got 2 men locked in the cargo hold, both drugged but alive. One of them matches the description of Charles Pemberton. The room seemed to exhale collectively. Edmund felt his knees weaken and sank back into his chair. He's alive? Pemberton is alive? Barely coherent, sir. But yes, alive. The ship's doctor is seeing to them now. Watson immediately grabbed his medical bag. Take me to them, Constable. They'll need proper care if they've been kept drugged for any length of time. As Watson hurried out with the constable, Holmes turned back to Griggs with an expression of cold satisfaction. You kept them alive as insurance, I presume, so you could release them, confused and discredited, if questions grew too insistent. But you couldn't simply let them go. They'd seen too much, knew too much. So you held them aboard a ship preparing to sail for Liverpool, planning to transport them far from London where they could be disposed of quietly, their bodies lost to the Irish Sea, rather more permanent than your ghostly misdirection. Griggs said nothing, but his silence was confirmation enough. Lestrade gestured to his constables. Take him to the station, and send word to the port authority. I want every vessel Griggs has had contact with in the past 6 months inspected thoroughly. As Griggs was led away, Lestrade turned to Holmes with grudging admiration. I'll admit, Mr. Holmes, when you came to me 3 days ago with this theory, I thought you were chasing shadows, ghosts on the Thames. But you've done it again, caught a criminal ring that's likely been operating for the better part of a year, recovered 2 missing men alive, and prevented God knows how much contraband from entering the country untaxed. The credit belongs largely to Mr. Hartley, Holmes replied, nodding toward Edmund. His meticulous observations and his courage in pursuing an investigation despite considerable personal risk, those are what solved this case. I merely connected the dots he had already identified. Edmund felt a flush of pride mixed with exhaustion. Through the window he could see movement on the quay. Constables with lanterns moving toward the hidden barge where Trask had performed his ghostly role. The fog was beginning to lift slightly, the Thames revealing itself in segments, water and mud, and the honest work of ships at anchor. It's over, then? Edmund asked quietly. Holmes pulled out his pipe and began, filling it with tobacco, a gesture of satisfaction after work completed. The smuggling ring is broken, your colleague will recover, and the fog wraith of Wapping will trouble no more witnesses. Yes, Mr. Hartley, it's over. The Thames will keep its mysteries, no doubt, but this particular darkness has been brought into the light. 3 days had passed since the arrests at the Wapping docks, and Baker Street had resumed its usual afternoon quiet. The muted sounds of traffic below, the tick of the clock on the mantel, the the occasional crackle from the fire that burned cheerfully against the November chill. Edmund Hartley sat in the comfortable chair that had become familiar to him over the past week, a cup of tea warming his hands, and felt something he had not experienced in months. Peace. Mrs. Hudson had outdone herself with the tea service. Not just tea, but small cakes and biscuits, the sort of spread usually reserved for more distinguished visitors. Yet she had insisted, saying that a man who had helped catch criminals deserved proper hospitality. Edmund had protested, but she would hear none of it, and so he found himself surrounded by small luxuries while Holmes and Watson occupied their respective chairs. The sitting room bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. "Pemberton is recovering well, I understand," Watson asked, setting down his medical journal. He had visited the hospital twice since the rescue, professional concern mingling with personal investment in the case's outcome. "Remarkably well, considering his ordeal," Edmund replied. "The doctors say the laudanum did no permanent damage, though his memories of the captivity are fragmentary, which is perhaps a mercy. He remembers being taken from his office, the darkness of the tunnel, being held in what he thought was a ship's hold. But the details are hazy, dreamlike. His wife has been at his bedside constantly. The children don't fully understand what happened, but they know their father has. Come home." "And the other man who was held with him?" Holmes asked from his position by the window, where he stood, watching the street below with that perpetual alertness that seemed to be his natural state. "A customs inspector, named William Marsh, taken 2 months before Pemberton. He'd noticed irregularities in cargo manifests from the Cormorant, and had begun asking questions. Like Pemberton, he was drugged, dragged through the tunnels, and held aboard the Mersey Star. He's physically well, but deeply shaken. He's requested a transfer to the Port Authority offices in Southampton, somewhere far from the Thames and its memories." Holmes nodded slowly. "Understandable. The docks will feel different to him now, I suspect. Once one has seen the darkness beneath the ordinary, it's difficult to forget it exists." Watson leaned forward, his expression both kind and curious. "And you, Mr. Hartley, how do you feel, returning to work at the customs house? Do you find yourself uneasy?" Edmund considered the question carefully. He had returned to his duties the previous morning, walking through the same corridors, sitting at the same desk, looking out at the same view of the Thames that had witnessed so much strangeness, and he had expected to feel fear, or at least lingering unease. Instead, he had felt something quite different. "Lighter," he said finally. "I feel lighter, if that makes sense. For weeks, I carried the weight of knowing something was wrong, but not knowing what. The footsteps in the fog, the disturbed ledges, the sense of being watched, all of it created a constant tension that I hadn't fully realized I was carrying until it was lifted. Now I know what was happening and why. The mystery has become simple fact, and facts, however unpleasant, are easier to bear than persistent uncertainty." "Well put," Holmes said, turning from the window with an approving expression. "It's the unknown that troubles us most deeply. Once illuminated, even the darkest truth becomes manageable. The human mind can adapt to almost any reality, but it struggles with ambiguity." "The other clerks have been talking, of course," Edmund continued. "The entire customs house knows what happened. Griggs's arrest, the discovery of the tunnel, the rescue of Pemberton and Marsh. Some are shocked that a man they worked alongside for years was organizing such an operation. Others claim they always suspected something was amiss, though I doubt that's true. But there's also relief. We all felt the tension of those disappearances, the worry that we might be next. Now that fear has lifted. Watson poured more tea for each of them, the domestic ritual a pleasant counterpoint to their discussion of criminal enterprise. And what will happen to Griggs and his associates? Lestrade tells me the case is quite solid, Holmes replied, accepting his cup with a nod of thanks. Griggs is facing charges of smuggling, kidnapping, conspiracy, and attempting to defraud the Crown collectively. They should see him imprisoned for a considerable period. The evidence is overwhelming. The tunnel system, the hidden barge, the testimony of the ship's crew who are coerced into holding Pemberton and Marsh, and most damningly, the ledgers we found in Warehouse 12, documenting 2 years of illegal cargo movement. He attempted to bargain, offering names of his suppliers and buyers in exchange for leniency. But the prosecution is disinclined to be generous. And Trask? Edmund asked. The man who played the ghost. Holmes's expression softened slightly. Trask is receiving more sympathetic treatment. He was desperate, an unemployed actor drowning in debt, offered what seemed like easy money for harmless theatrical work. He claims, and I believe him, that he had no knowledge of the kidnappings or the full scope of the smuggling operation. He thought he was simply helping move cargo discreetly, avoiding excessive taxation rather than breaking the law entirely. A fine distinction, perhaps, but one that matters to the courts. He's cooperating fully with the investigation and will likely receive a reduced sentence, a few months, rather than years. When he's released, I've suggested to Lestrade that the man might find legitimate theatrical work if someone vouched for his character after his debt to society is paid. Watson smiled. You've vouched for him yourself, haven't you, Holmes? I may have written a letter to a theatre manager of my acquaintance, Holmes admitted, with the slightest hint of embarrassment at his own generosity. Trask has genuine talent. His performance as the fog wraith was quite convincing. It would be a waste to see that talent lost to permanent criminality when rehabilitation seems genuinely possible. Edmund found himself moved by this evidence of compassion beneath Holmes's reputation for cold rationality. That's kind of you, Mr. Holmes, more kind than many would be. Justice and vengeance are not the same thing, Holmes replied. Griggs organized and profited from a criminal enterprise that terrorized honest men and corrupted the dock's operations. Trask was a desperate fool who made poor choices. The law should distinguish between them. The fire crackled, and for a moment they sat in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Through the window, Baker Street was settling into evening, shop lights coming on, pedestrians hurrying home to their suppers, the lamplighter beginning his rounds. London's vast machinery of ordinary life continuing its eternal rhythm. I've been thinking, Edmund said slowly, about what you said, Mr. Holmes, about patterns, how you saw patterns in things that seemed random to everyone else. The timing of the ghost's appearances, the connection to the cormorant, the correlation between foggy nights and missing men. I've spent years looking at shipping manifests, noticing small discrepancies, catching errors in documentation. But I never thought to look at the larger pattern, to step back and see how individual anomalies might connect into something systematic. That's the difference between recording facts and interpreting them, Holmes observed. You had all the pieces, Mr. Hartley. You noticed the disturbed ledgers, the footsteps, the pale figure, Pemberton's disappearance. What you lacked was not observation, but context, the framework that would reveal how those pieces fit together. That's what Watson and I provided. A different perspective, experience with criminal operations, and perhaps most importantly, distance from the situation that allowed us to see it clearly. You're too modest, Watson interjected. What Holmes won't say, Mr. Hartley, is that very few people could have assembled that framework as quickly or as accurately as he did. What took him 4 days would take Scotland Yard 4 months, if they managed it at all. Holmes waved a dismissive hand, but Edmund could see the faint pleasure in his expression at Watson's praise. Their friendship, he realized, was built on this foundation: Watson's steady admiration and Holmes's pretense of indifference to it, each man providing what the other needed. "What matters," Edmund said, "is that Pemberton is home with his family, that Marsh will recover, and that the docks are free of the fear that's haunted them. The Thames can return to being simply the Thames, a working river, difficult and occasionally dangerous, but no longer hiding deliberate malice beneath its fog." "Beautifully expressed," Watson said warmly. "And you, Mr. Hartley, what will you do now? Continue your work at the Customs House?" Edmund nodded. "Yes, though I've been offered a promotion, senior clerk, with responsibility for investigating irregularities across all the riverside customs houses. Apparently, my diligence and courage in the face of criminal conspiracy, that's how the Port Authority phrased it, have been noticed. I'll have a small office in the Central Administration Building and Authority to audit any documentation that seems questionable." "Excellent," Holmes said with genuine enthusiasm. "London's docks will benefit from having someone with your eye for detail and your determination to follow evidence wherever it leads. And if you ever encounter another mystery that seems to resist conventional explanation, you know where to find us." "I do indeed." Edmund set down his teacup and rose, extending his hand first to Watson, then to Holmes. "Gentlemen, I cannot adequately express my gratitude. You saved my life, rescued my colleague, and restored order to a place that had begun to feel haunted. I came to you frightened and uncertain, and you responded with intelligence, courage, and kindness. Thank you." Holmes shook his hand firmly. "You gave yourself too little credit, Mr. Hartley. You came to us having already done the difficult work, noticing what others missed, documenting what seemed inexplicable, trusting your own observations despite pressure to dismiss them. We merely helped you understand what you had already discovered. The courage was yours from the beginning." Mrs. Hudson appeared to show Edmund out, and as he descended the stairs to Baker Street, he paused at the door and looked back up toward the sitting room, where light still glowed warmly in the windows. 2 men sat there, he knew, already discussing their next case, or perhaps simply enjoying their evening. A detective and a doctor. An unlikely partnership that had brought order to chaos and light to darkness. Edmund stepped out into the evening, pulling his coat close against the November chill. The air was clear tonight. No fog rising from the Thames, no mysteries hiding in the darkness. Just London, vast and complicated and alive, full of ordinary people, living ordinary lives. He walked towards the omnibus stop, his footsteps echoing on the pavement, and for the first time in weeks, he did not listen for other footsteps matching his own. The river when he reached it, was simply a river, water and ships and the eternal work of commerce. The docks, when he saw them in the distance, were simply docks. The Specter was gone. The Thames flowed on, patient and ancient, carrying its cargo toward the sea. And Edmund Hartley, customs clerk and newly appointed investigator, walked home through a London that felt, at last, free of ghosts.